Good morning. Welcome back to another day of Bible study. So glad that you are here with us for the Whole50 Bible study. I actually have one of the points up from the Bible study today. So let's take that down and let us put up the right passage that is for today's Bible study. We are in First John chapter 2. Today on day 44, this is the last week of the Whole50 Bible study. I'm grateful for those of you who have been along with us for the entire journey, and also grateful for those of you who are just joining us for the first time today. Our whole goal with this Bible study is simply to get a more holistic view of our spiritual health, maybe expand it, maybe deepen it just a little bit, and come into a better relationship with Jesus Christ. What a incredible weekend it was for those of you who were able to make it to Northeastern Ohio for our in-person gathering yesterday. Absolutely incredible. Weather was perfect. It was so fun to see so many old friends who were there, old in time period, not old in age, and also so fun to see so many new faces there as well. We're going to be back up in Cleveland. I think, let me in fact just take a look right here. I think the date is June 27th, the last Sunday in June. We will be back up in Cleveland for another in-person gathering, so you can join us there. Until that time, though, I want to encourage you to make sure that you're aware of all of the things that are going on here at Christ's Table. You can visit our website at www.christtable.today, whether you're in Northeastern Ohio or anywhere across the U.S. In fact, we're starting to plant these things everywhere. So if you are interested in starting a gathering, make sure that you are familiar with christtable.today, that you're on the email list, and even let me know, because things are moving fast, and we want to make sure that we're equipping you for all the ministry that God has called you to do. For us, though, we are 1 week from today away from starting this new Bible study, Party On, about food, feast, fasts in the New Testament. You can get yours by donating at christtable.today, or simply just by letting me know that you'd like one. Most of you have gotten these in the mail already. A few of you, though, should be getting them today or tomorrow at the latest. So I'm not going to yet tell what the gift is, but I've even had some people reach out to me and say, could we get some extras of these so that we can encourage some people who are in our friend network to be a part of this? And the answer to that is yes. I do have some extras of these. Not a lot, but I have a few. And if you would like to claim a few of those, then simply let me know. But I want to thank all of those people who donate to christtable.today. All of this is possible solely because of your investment in this ministry. And it was amazing yesterday to hear the stories of so many people who have been blessed, whose lives are being transformed. Many who haven't been connected or involved with a church or a spiritual network of individuals for years, and now have that, and just seeing their faces and hearing their stories is just amazing. And that's because of your investment and involvement in this thing that God is doing. So we find ourselves today in First John chapter 2. Now, the letters from John here at the end of your Bible, just before Revelation, are not a familiar place for a lot of people. They are small, which is good, but a lot of pastors don't end up going there. And they also are, they're kind of difficult because John's writing style, if you've read the Gospel of John, and especially if you've read 1st, 2nd, or 3rd John, is really kind of a difficult style. So I can't explain all of the nuances here to you this morning, but what I can say about John is that these letters are written to churches, and this one in particular is being written to a church that's had a crisis. There's been a disagreement in the church. Some people have left from the congregation, and John actually is writing to the people who are left in the church who didn't leave. And one of the things that I think is difficult, and something that we should know actually about this, is that whenever John confronts this disagreement or this issue. He confronts it head on. It doesn't seem as though he really wants to get into the weeds too much on what happened or how it happened. He just wants to help them move on from here. And the other thing that we need to know about this especially is that when we say that people have left the church over it, in our mind, what we see is a building with the name church on it that has maybe pews or rows of seats and a platform and writing and a pulpit and a choir. And we think they just kind of went down the road to some other church building and now they're there. And that's not the picture that would have been the case. There were no church buildings that were dedicated to church for hundreds of years, certainly not during this time period. The other thing that we have to see is that this is really simply a house church, people who met in a living room, just like this one. And it was the church. Church simply means a group of called out people. And so it's just the group of people who follow Christ in that city would have met together in a situation just like the living room right behind me. And so whenever we say that they've left the church, what we mean is really that they've just simply walked away from the fellowship of believers. And maybe they started meeting on their own somewhere else, but it wasn't as though they're going to some other established church or some other location. They've walked away from the fellowship, from the community. And so with that in mind, why don't we just go ahead and jump into 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 through 11. So he's talked a little bit about the theology of the disagreement up until this point, and the disagreement was over whether or not you could become perfect in this life, whether or not you could reach perfection this side of heaven. And John says we can be sure that we know him if we obey his commands. And so part of what the disagreement was bringing to the forefront was this idea of how can you be sure that you know God? If the only way that you can know God is for you to be absolutely perfect, then anybody who is struggling with sin, anyone who's suffering, anyone who isn't living at this perfect level just doesn't know God. And so it was creating this idea of super Christians and super apostles and people who were a cut above everybody else. I once served in a church with a bunch of people, or a group of people who thought that, like here in John, you could be perfect. And several of them thought that they had attained perfection until you talk to their spouse, and their spouses said, well, no, not so much. Well, then, the idea, well, what does perfection mean? We've attained theological perfection. Even though we may still sin some, we've still hit perfection. Well, that's even more dangerous. Introduce yourself to someone who thinks that they are perfect in what they believe and what they think. Oi. So John says here, you can still be sure that you know God, even if you struggle, like Paul says he struggles in Romans 6 and 7, if you obey his commands. Well, that kind of begs the question, okay, well, what are the commands? So John says, if someone claims, I know God, but they don't obey God's commands, and I love it, John just calls it out here, that person's a liar and isn't living in the truth. This is why, for me, truth is so important, especially in the context of church, especially in the context of followers of Jesus Christ. Church must be a place, the community of believers must be a place where truth reigns. And so oftentimes, unfortunately, that's just not the primary value, or it's not even a core value. It's not only dangerous, but it's absolutely, utterly destructive if it's not. John says, you know what? If you're not a person of truth, if you're not living in truth, if you're not obeying God's commands, especially, and this is where John's going to talk here, especially the command about love, then you don't know God. You shouldn't be claiming that you know God. But those who obey God's word truly show how completely they love him. And so for John, we see this tied together between love and obedience. Not perfect obedience, but just a desire, a striving to live the right way, to do the right thing, to follow the commands that Jesus has given us and that God has given us. And so here's the command again. So it's kind of begging the question, what are the commands? What are this list of things? If I can't truly know God unless I'm following his commands, I really kind of want to know what the commands are. So John says, this is how we know we're living in him. Those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did. Okay, so John has now kind of boiled it down a little bit for us. And I said, okay, I'm driving you towards the answer to these issues that you're facing and the questions that I've raised. And really, this is all tied to Jesus. It all comes back to Jesus. It's not an Old Testament sacrificial system. It's not this moral perfection. Really, the answer to knowing God, living for God, loving God is all wrapped up in this idea of living our lives as Jesus did. And so he's now set Jesus up as the model for us. And he's saying your life and your living your life needs to be a reflection of Jesus' life and how Jesus lived as well. So, dear friends, John says, if I can boil this down for you, John says, I'm not writing a new commandment for you. I'm not giving you anything new here. These are things that you should already know. These are things that you should already be living out. And the fact that many aren't is why there are problems, is why there's conflict, is why people have left. What I'm telling you here is really old. You've heard it from the very beginning. This old commandment to love one another is the same message you heard before. You've been hearing this since you were children, to love one another. This is wrapped up in the Jewish law. Love one another. So it goes back centuries, John says. It goes back millennia. And this is it, to love one another. But then John says, you know what? It's also new. This is a very old command. Even today, if you didn't grow up in the Jewish system or even in a religious system, this idea of loving one another is very old. It's hopefully, for most of us, has been taught to us since before we could walk. It's a part of what we learn in kindergarten, loving one another. But it's also new. There's a nuance to this loving one another that we have learned now because of Jesus Christ. And so there's a new dimension to this thing of loving one another. And if you don't get this new dimension, John says, relationships are going to break down. You're not going to get along. People are going to walk away from the church. They're going to think they can do this perfectly. Jesus lived, John says now in verse 8, the truth of this commandment, and you also are living it. For the darkness is disappearing and the true light is already shining. This isn't hidden. You're able to see the truth of this, and you're able to see it in Jesus. It's not a secret theology. It's not something that, you have to wait until you get to the second or third or fourth level of Christendom in order to find it out. This is absolutely apparent to anybody who is paying attention to Jesus and how he lived. If anyone claims I'm living in the light but hates a fellow believer, that person's still living in darkness. Think about that for just a moment. Apparently, this was a situation that was going on in the church there, that people were saying, we live in the light, but because you're not perfect, we can't be in fellowship with you. We hate you. boy, how many times have we heard hate spew between or about or over other followers of Jesus Christ? Now, we might not use the word hate, but we're using synonyms for the word hate. We're using actions that show that there is hate within our hearts for this person, or a lot more often for what they believe. How many denominations hate other denominations or people from other denominations? How many theological systems hate people who have other theologies or other beliefs? I don't need to go into all of them, but abortion, homosexuality, climate change, any issue, vaccinations and wearing masks. God's protecting us, or we're protecting ourselves and doing due diligence. We have a tendency to hate other believers. I mean, we're not even talking here. John isn't about hating the world or hating evil or hating sin, but we're talking about hating other followers of Jesus. And John says, you cannot be a follower of Jesus and hate other followers of Jesus. It can't happen. You're living in darkness. Anyone who loves a fellow believer, though, is living in the light and doesn't cause others to stumble. Which means that if you hate other believers, if your heart and your mind isn't in the right place, if you're not truly being loving, you're not living in the light, which means you're in darkness, and that's a spiritual issue, and you're causing other believers to stumble. John seems to be saying here it might be better for those other people to not be in the congregation right now, because they're living in darkness, but they think they're living in light. But they're not, because they're not leading with love. But anyone who hates, and will end here, a fellow believer is still living and walking in darkness. So John just clarifies it for us. And such a person doesn't know the way to go because they've been blinded by darkness. The difficulty of being blinded by darkness is so oftentimes we become so blind to the darkness that we don't realize that we're in darkness. We feel like we're in the light and everybody else is in dark. It's a dangerous place to be, so how do you know? Well, I think John has already said it to us. The only way that you know is whether or not you're living out the primary commandment of faith. Whether or not you are doing that love thing well. Love is the key. Love is the key to John, from his gospel to 1 John, to 3 John, and right here in the middle in 2 John. We're actually in 1 John. It's also the key in 2 John and in 3 John. Love is the key. Love is the key to understanding whether or not you're living in darkness or living in light. Love is the key to understanding whether or not you're a follower of Jesus Christ or you're following something else. Love is the key. That is the first and greatest commandment for John, is love. And so John references, and even in our study this morning, if you have the Bible study book for the Whole50, it asks this question about the new commandment versus the old commandment. Well, both commandments were love. Love was important even in the Old Testament. But in the Old Testament, love was love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. It was when you see other people, love other people as much as you love yourself. But that breaks down for a lot of us because we have a tendency to convince ourselves that we're living in a way that we're not. I love you as much as I love me. Do you really have a great view of yourself? Many of us, there's so much self-loathing and so much self-hate that we can love somebody else and actually be hating them because we hate ourselves. So love your neighbor as yourself isn't a bad model, but Jesus sets up a better one. And this is the new commandment that John is reinforcing here. And he's going back essentially to his gospel, chapter 15, where there's an entire speech about love and about this topic. Because for Jesus, it wasn't just love one another, love each other as you love yourselves, but it's love each other as I have loved you. Jesus says, here's the bar here's the bar for the world. Love other people. But God comes along and he says to the Old Testament, to the Israelites, he says, I don't want you to just love other people. I want you to love other people like you love yourself. I want you to bring them to your level. But Jesus shows up and Jesus says, I want you to love other people, but I want to give you an even better example. I want to give you a higher bar, actually, for love. I want you to love other people as I have loved you. The love that I have shown you, this self-sacrificial, this giving love, this love that invites everybody to the table, this love that treats all people equally, this love that says you can be different than me, but God can still love you, this love that says I'm going to put you first and me last. This kind of love that Jesus has shown to me is the kind of love that I am expected to show others. That's the commandment. That's the new commandment. Love each other, not as much as yourself, but I want you to love each other like I have loved you. And finally, whoever hates a fellow Christian is clearly still in the dark. John and his gospel and his letters are just jam-packed full of this phrase, love one another, which can be translated to love other followers of Christ. John focuses on it so much because it must be a problem, not just for John, not just for the early church, but we're left with it in the Bible because it must be a problem for us as well. So I wonder if you hate fellow Christians. Sometimes the hate is so deep that you will say that because of this political belief or because of this cultural issue or because of this identity topic or this viewpoint on whatever this theological thing is, well, that person can't be a follower of Christ because they believe that. And that person can't be a follower of Christ because they think that. And that person can't be a follower of Christ because the Bible clearly says that, fill in the blank. And this person, it's still kind of suspect. So it's okay if I hate these people because we're not really in the kingdom. And you're doing the same thing. You're doing the same thing that these people here in the church that John's writing to did. You are setting yourself up as being the perfect arbiter of God's law and God's beliefs on things. And you're saying, because I'm living well and I'm not sinning and I'm perfect, I'm going to make a decision as to who's in and who's out and who's okay and who's not okay. And in fact, the mantra, the slogan for that type of mentality is love the sin, hate the sinner, thus implying that somebody else other than you is a sinful sinner because you're perfect. If you hate a fellow Christian, and let's just call what it is, hate. If you hate a fellow Christian, then John gives some very strong words. You are clearly still in the dark. And there are many synonyms and many actions for hate here that spread a pretty big umbrella over top of a lot of people who name the name of Jesus but are living in darkness. Don't let that be you. Don't let that be you. Live that new command like nobody else lives it. Love one another as I, Jesus says, have loved you. Until tomorrow, happy reading.